The air in the Redemption Town Hall was thick enough to chew, smelling of wet wool, cheap whiskey, and the cloying sweetness of church potluck cakes. Outside, winter had the territory by the throat, burying the world in a shroud of silent, unforgiving white. Inside, the heat from the potbelly stove was a suffocating blanket, making the press of bodies feel even tighter. At the edge of the room, standing so still she might have been carved from porcelain, was Leanne. She was a splash of delicate color in a world of brown and gray, her light pink prairie dress a testament to a life left behind, an ocean away. She was the town's project, the Chinese widow they had decided to help with a grand gesture of a charity auction, but the charity felt more like a burden they were eager to discharge. Her hands were clasped before her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the rough-hewn stage where the auctioneer, Mr. Abernathy, was selling off donated sacks of flour and jars of preserves with booming false enthusiasm. Lynn had brought her quilts, the only things of value she had left. They were her stories, her memories, her heart stitched into patterns of silk and cotton. 3 of them lay folded on a small table near the stage, a riot of impossible color. Crimson dragons chasing pearl-white moons, emerald-green bamboo shoots reaching for a golden sun, and a field of peonies so vivid they seemed to breathe. They were beautiful, and they were utterly foreign. The townsfolk glanced at them, then away, their faces impassive or, worse, faintly amused. They did not see art. They saw otherness. At the back of the hall, leaning against the cold wall near the door, a man stood like a mountain that had wandered in from the range. Flint was his name, though few dared to use it. He was immense, a monolith of muscle and bone wrapped in buckskin and fur, his hair and beard a wild, dark tangle that fell to his chest. He was a creature of the high peaks and silent forests, a man who spoke in grunts and gestures and whose presence alone was enough to quiet a saloon. He came to town twice a year for supplies and was gone before the dust settled. Today, something had held him. It wasn't the auction. It was the woman in the pink dress. He watched her, saw the rigid set of her shoulders, the tremor in her hands she tried so desperately to hide. He saw the pride warring with fear in her dark, almond-shaped eyes. Then he saw the quilts, and for the first time all day, the silent mountain man felt something stir in the frozen landscape of his chest. Mr. Abernathy, sweating under the lantern light, finally gestured to Leanne's offerings. "And now, folks, we have these, blankets, made by Mrs. Chang herself. A lot of fine needlework here, I'm sure." His voice lacked its earlier boom. It was the tone a man used to sell a lame horse out of pity. He picked up the quilt with the crimson dragons, holding it awkwardly. The intricate stitching, the 1,000 tiny knots that formed the creature's scales, were lost on the crowd. They saw only a strange, garish thing. A silence fell over the room, thick and uncomfortable. It was broken by a loud, braying laugh. It came from Jed Barrett, a rancher whose land and ego were the 2 biggest things in the county. He sat with his cronies, his face flushed with whiskey. "What in thunder is that, Abernathy?" Barrett called out, enjoying the attention. "A man could get nightmares sleeping under a thing like a big red lizard." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the hall. Leanne's back went straighter, a single defiant act against the wave of mockery. Her chin lifted, though a faint blush of shame crept up her neck. She had poured her soul into that quilt, a story of strength and good fortune from her homeland, and they were laughing at it. "It's a dragon," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying in the sudden lull. Her English was precise, touched with the melody of her native tongue. Barrett turned his mocking gaze on her. "A dragon, you say? Well, we don't have much call for dragons out here, little lady." He looked back at the auctioneer. "Too thin for a horse blanket, too ugly for a bed. What's the bid, Abernathy? A nickel for the rags?" Abernathy cleared his throat, his face reddening. "We'll start the bidding at $1. $1 for this unique quilt." The silence returned, heavier this time, freighted with humiliation. Leanne stared at a knot in the floorboards, willing herself not to cry, not to show them the wound they had so casually inflicted. Flint watched her from the back, his jaw tight. He saw the single tear that escaped and traced a path down her cheek. He saw her dignity, a fragile flame flickering in a cruel wind. He felt a sudden, unfamiliar surge of cold fury. Abernathy waited. $1? Anyone? 50 cents, then, for the church donation box. He was about to fold the quilt, to dismiss it and her with it, when a voice like grinding stones echoed from the back of the room. $10. The words dropped into the silence, each one a heavy stone. Every head in the hall swiveled. Flint pushed himself off the wall, his massive frame seeming to suck the very air from the room. He did not shout. He did not have to. His voice carried a weight that demanded attention. Mr. Abernathy's jaw dropped. He stared, speechless, at the giant figure by the door. Jed Barrett, however, recovered quickly, a sneer twisting his lips. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Got tired of talking to squirrels, mountain man?" Flint's eyes, the color of a winter sky over granite, moved slowly to fix on Barrett. He didn't speak. He just looked. And in that gaze was a quiet promise of violence that made the rancher's cronies shift nervously in their seats. Barrett's sneer faltered. He cleared his throat and looked away, taking a sudden interest in his whiskey glass. Flint turned his attention back to the stage. $10, he repeated, his voice rumbling, for the quilt. Abernathy finally found his voice, stammering. $10? I have $10 from Mr. Flint. Do I hear 11? Do I hear 10.50? The room was utterly still. No one was foolish enough to challenge the mountain man, and no one else wanted the strange blanket anyway. Flint reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a coin. It wasn't silver. It was a $20 gold piece. He strode forward, the crowd parting before him as if by instinct. He didn't walk to the stage. He walked to the heavy oak barrel by the front row where the money was being collected and dropped the gold piece onto it. The clink was deafening. He looked at Abernathy. "Keep the change for the church." The auctioneer nodded dumbly. "Sold to Mr. Flint." Flint walked to the table where the quilts lay. He ignored the auctioneer, ignored the staring crowd. He looked at Leanne. For the first time, their eyes met directly. He saw surprise, confusion, and a flicker of profound, weary gratitude. She saw an intensity in his gaze that was neither pity nor charity, but something else entirely, something she couldn't name. Without a word, he picked up not just the dragon quilt, but all three of them, folding them with a surprising gentleness in his large, calloused hands. He tucked them under his arm, gave her one last lingering look, and turned to leave. The whispers started before the door had even swung shut behind him. Leanne stood frozen amidst the rising tide of gossip. The warmth of the room now felt suffocating, the stares of the townspeople like tiny, sharp needles. She had been saved from one humiliation only to be thrown into the center of a new, more confusing one. The mountain man. Why? No one understood him, and his actions were now tangled up with her. She began to gather the few small embroidered handkerchiefs that hadn't sold, her hands trembling. That was when she sensed a presence beside her. It was Jed Barrett, his shadow falling over her table. He smelled of stale whiskey and self-satisfaction. "That was quite a show," he said, his voice a low, insinuating drawl. "Never figured old Flint had an eye for fancy sewing, or for the seamstress." Leanne kept her eyes down, focusing on folding a small square of cotton. She would not give him the satisfaction of a response. Her silence only seemed to egg him on. "You must have something special to make a man like that open his purse. A real quiet one he is. Maybe you got ways of making him talk." His words were crude, his meaning clear. A wave of nausea washed over her. She felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of anger and shame. She clutched her basket of wares and tried to step around him. He moved to block her path, his bulk trapping her against the table. "Don't you walk away when I'm talking to you," he growled, his voice losing its playful edge. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "This is a decent town, and we don't like complications. You and your pet giant are a complication." Pain shot up her arm, but it was the humiliation that truly stung. She looked up at him, her eyes flashing with a fire he hadn't expected. "Let go of me." Her voice was a low whisper, but it was not pleading. It was a command. Barrett laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Or what? Your big friend isn't here to save you now." But he was wrong. The heavy oak door of the town hall creaked open, letting in a swirl of frigid air and snow. Framed in the doorway, a black silhouette against the deepening winter twilight, stood Flint. He had the quilts tucked under one arm. He hadn't gone to his horse. He had been waiting. His eyes took in the scene in an instant. Barrett's hand on Leanne's arm, the fear and defiance in her face, the ugly triumph on the rancher's. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply took one slow, deliberate step into the room. Barrett's bravado evaporated like mist in the sun. He dropped Leanne's arm as if it had suddenly become red hot. He took a stumbling step back, holding his hands up in a gesture of mock surrender. "Just having a friendly conversation with the lady, Flint," he said, his voice suddenly several notes higher. "No harm done." Flint's gaze remained locked on him, flat and cold and promising a world of hurt. The mountain man didn't even glance at the other men in the room. He knew they were no threat. His entire formidable presence was focused on the rancher. He took another step, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He still hadn't spoken, and the silence was more terrifying than any threat. Barrett was sweating now, despite the cold draft from the door. All right, he muttered, backing away towards his friends. "I'm leaving." He practically scrambled to get away, his retreat clumsy and devoid of dignity. Flint watched him go, his expression unchanging until Barrett had disappeared into the crowd. Only then did his gaze soften as he turned to Leanne. She stood clutching her arm, her face pale but her eyes steady. He walked to her, his movements slow and careful, as if approaching a frightened doe. He looked at the basket of unsold goods at her feet, then back at her. His voice, when it finally came, was a low rumble, devoid of anger now, holding only a quiet certainty. "The lady is leaving," he said. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was a statement of what was about to happen. He reached down and gently took the heavy basket from her grasp. Her fingers brushed against his, and a jolt of warmth passed between them, startling them both. He straightened up, the basket held easily in one hand, the quilts tucked securely under his other arm. "I will walk you," he said. He turned and started for the door, assuming she would follow. After a moment's hesitation, she did, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and walking out of the oppressive heat of the town hall and into the clean, cold air of the winter night, leaving the whispers and the stares behind her. The world outside was hushed, muffled by a fresh layer of snow that glittered under the light of a rising moon. The street was empty, the sounds of the auction already fading behind them. Their boots were the only sound, a soft, rhythmic crunching that measured out the silence between them. Flint walked a pace ahead of her, his broad back a shield against the wind and the world. Leanne followed in his footsteps, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and a strange, burgeoning sense of safety she hadn't felt since her husband had died. Her small cabin was at the very edge of town, where the last lantern post gave way to the dark immensity of the forest. The walk was not long, but it felt like a journey. The silence was not awkward. It was a shared space, a quiet understanding that words would only cheapen. As they reached the small, dark shape of her home, Leanne finally found her voice. Why? The word was small, barely a whisper, almost stolen by the wind. Flint stopped and turned to face her. The moonlight caught in his wild beard, dusting it with silver. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable in the shadows. He considered her question for a long time, as if weighing each possible answer. He was not a man who wasted words. When he spoke, his answer was brutally simple. It was a good quilt, he said. But the way he said it, the deep sincerity in his voice, told her he meant more. He meant the work, the care, the story in the stitches. He had seen what the others had not. At her door, he set her basket down on the snow-dusted porch. Then he did something that stunned her. He held out the 3 quilts he had bought. These are yours. Leanne stared at the folded stacks of color, then back at him, bewildered. But you paid. $10. You paid for them. A shake of his massive head. I paid the town, he clarified, his voice low. I paid them to stop their noise. The quilts belong with the one who made them. His meaning was clear. He had bought her peace, not her property. It was a gesture of such profound respect that it left her breathless. He saw the pride in her, the spirit that refused to be broken, and he would not wound it by making her a charity case. He began to turn, his duty done, ready to melt back into the mountains from which he came. Wait! The word was stronger this time, carrying a new resolve. Flint paused, his back to her. He turned his head slightly, waiting. She stepped forward, her small form determined in the cold moonlight. You live in the mountains, she stated, not a question. He gave a slight nod. You have a blanket for this winter? A proper one? He was silent for a moment. I have hides, he said finally. Bearskin and wolf pelts. They were warm, but they were not a home. They were survival. Leanne looked at the quilts in her arms, then at the vast, dark forest that was his home. An idea took root, a way to reclaim her own agency, to turn his act of kindness into an exchange between equals. Make me a promise, she said, her voice firm. He turned fully to face her now, intrigued by the strength in her tone. You will let me make you another one, for you, not for the town, not for money, as a gift, for the kindness you have shown me. Flint studied her face, illuminated by the pale lantern light spilling from her window. He saw her fierce, stubborn pride, her unyielding need to not be indebted to anyone. He saw the artist who needed to create, the woman who needed to give. A long moment passed. He looked from her determined face to the dark, lonely mountains behind him, and then back. A slow, single nod was his answer. All right. It was a pact, sealed in the frozen air between them. It marked the beginning of a strange and silent conversation. 2 days later, a stack of perfectly split firewood appeared on her porch. She knew who had left it. A week after that, a freshly dressed rabbit ready for her stew pot. He never knocked. He never waited for thanks. He simply provided. And inside her small cabin, by the warmth of his wood, Leanne began to work. She chose her colors with care. The deep, stormy blues of a mountain sky at dusk, the charcoal gray of granite cliffs, the silver of a winter moon. She stitched the story of a silent, powerful protector, a guardian of the high places. Their 2 worlds, once so far apart, began to weave together, thread by silent thread. The town, of course, watched. It was a small place, and a secret was harder to keep than a summer calf. Flint's regular trips to the edge of town did not go unnoticed. The sight of the huge mountain man leaving firewood on the Chinese widow's porch was fuel for weeks of gossip. Barrett, his pride still smarting from his public humiliation, was the most vocal. He spread ugly rumors in the saloon, painting Leanne as a cunning seductress and Flint as her witless, enchanted giant. The women of the town, led by Barrett's wife, took to crossing the street to avoid Leanne, their whispers following her like a chill wind. She felt their judgment, their suspicion, and it was a heavier burden than the winter cold. Yet she did not falter. The silent arrangement with Flint had given her a purpose, a shield against their scorn. She poured her loneliness and her hope into the quilt, each stitch a small act of defiance. If you find yourself touched by this story of two lonely souls finding each other, please consider taking a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support is the firewood that keeps our stories warm, and we thank you for it. One morning, the world woke up to a screaming gale. A blizzard descended from the peaks with a fury that rattled windows and shook the very foundations of the town. Snow fell not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding curtain. For 3 days, redemption was cut off from the world, each family an island in a sea of white. The temperature plummeted. Wood piles dwindled. A quiet panic began to set in as the storm showed no sign of breaking. The town's shared woodlot was nearly empty, and the forest was inaccessible, buried under 10 feet of snow. It was on the 3rd day that a figure emerged from the blizzard, a titan moving through the gale. It was Flint. He had fashioned a massive sled from 2 young pines, and he was hauling a mountain of firewood, a load that should have required a team of oxen. He had gone into the teeth of the storm, to the high ridges where the winds scoured the snow from the deadfalls, and he had worked. He made his way to the town square and began unloading the wood, stacking it near the church for anyone to take. He worked without stopping, his breath pluming in the frigid air, his massive frame a bulwark against the storm's rage. He made 3 trips before dusk, and by then there was enough wood to see the town through another week. As he worked on his final load, a small figure appeared, battling through the wind. It was Leanne, carrying a steaming pot of broth, her face numb with cold. She didn't say a word. She just handed it to him. He stopped, took the pot in his frost-rimmed gloves, and drank. In that moment, as the whole town watched from their windows, they saw not a monster in his victim, but 2 people caring for one another, an alliance forged in silence and strength. When the blizzard finally broke, the world was reborn in blinding white and brilliant blue. The air was clean and sharp, and so was the town's perspective. They had been cold, and they had been scared, and the man they had feared had saved them. The rumors died in the face of a mountain of firewood. The stares that followed Flint were now filled with a grudging, hard-won respect. He walked through town, and men nodded to him. He had proven his worth in the only language the frontier truly understood: action. He finished his business at the general store, and then, instead of heading back to his mountain, he walked the now cleared path to Leanne's cabin. She must have been watching for him, for the door opened before he reached it. She stood there, and in her hands she held the finished quilt. It was magnificent. It was the heart of the mountain, the soul of the winter sky. It was shades of storm and stone and moonlight, stitched together with a skill that was breathtaking. The pattern was of a great soaring hawk against a backdrop of jagged peaks, a creature of freedom and solitude. She held it out to him, an offering. He took it, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle on the soft fabric. But he didn't look at the quilt. His eyes were fixed on her face. A battle was raging within him, a struggle to find the words for feelings he had never known he possessed. "My cabin is cold," he said, his voice raspy, lower than usual. He had built it with his own hands, solid and strong, but it was just a shelter. "It is empty." He paused, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken emotion. He took a deep, shuddering breath, a man stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "It is a house," he said, his gaze unwavering, intense. "It is not a home." He had said more in those few sentences than he had in the past year. He took one more step, closing the small distance between them. "I ask you," he said, the words torn from the deepest part of him, "to make it a home with me." Leanne's dark eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. They spilled over, tracing paths through the faint dusting of flour on her cheeks. She did not look away. She had waited a lifetime to be seen, to be truly seen for who she was. And this silent man from the mountains, he saw everything. "Yes," she whispered, the word a puff of steam in the cold air. "Yes, Flint, I will." They were married 1 week later, on a Sunday after the circuit preacher made his monthly rounds. The ceremony was held in the very town hall where she had been so cruelly humiliated. This time, however, the atmosphere was entirely different. The room was not crowded, but it was full. The people who came did so out of a quiet respect that had replaced their earlier suspicion. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, who had always offered a kind smile, sat in the front row, openly dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Mr. Abernathy stood near the back, his expression humbled. Jed Barrett and his cronies were nowhere to be seen. Leanne wore the same simple pink prairie dress, a defiant symbol of who she was and where she had come from. But over her shoulders she wore a new shawl of deep blue wool, which she had embroidered with a pattern of snow-capped mountain peaks. Flint stood beside her, taller and more solid than the building itself. He had tied his long, dark hair back with a simple leather cord. In place of his usual buckskins, he wore a clean, dark wool shirt and trousers, a concession to the formality of the day that touched Leanne's heart. He looked uncomfortable, a great bear forced into a pen, but when he looked at her, all his awkwardness vanished, replaced by a look of fierce, protective tenderness. When the time came for their vows, the preacher's words seemed to fade into the background. There were only the two of them. Flint's vow was as direct and unadorned as the man himself. He took her small hands in his. "I will protect you," he said, his deep voice filling the quiet hall, his eyes never leaving hers. "I will keep you safe." When it was her turn, Leanne's voice was clear and steady, imbued with a strength no one in that room had ever heard from her before. "And I," she said, her grip tightening on his hands, "will keep you warm." When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Flint did not kiss her in front of the crowd. Instead, he simply leaned down and gently touched his forehead to hers, a private, profound gesture of union. They walked out of the town hall and into the brilliant, cold sunshine. His horse, a powerful roan, stood waiting. Without a word, Flint lifted her and set her on the saddle as if she weighed nothing at all. He swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins, creating a circle of warmth and strength. He turned the horse not towards the town, but towards the towering, silent peaks that rose against the blue sky. Together they rode away from redemption, leaving its judgments and its smallness behind them. Two solitary souls who had found their own world, a home stitched together from courage, kindness, and the quiet language of the heart.